Omaha Beachhead. So this is kind of an interesting beast. Not really beast. An interesting game. It's about the size, in terms of, it could have been covered with some of the later SPI, S&T magazines, just before they kind of went under, in terms of not the components, but say the number of counters, the amount of rules, etc., the complexity, and kind of neat little ideas. But it came out from Victory Games, and also the scope of the engagement. It's a decent number of counters on a singular topic that's fairly small and well contained in terms of an operational content. Think about something along the lines of Operation Grenade, or even Sicily's kind of a bigger scope, I think. But where you're looking, in this case, a few days of the D-Day invasions on one sector, on one of the beachheads, basically, and the breakout from that. And that idea of the scope, etc. Except they put it in a box. They gave it some nicer quality components in terms of larger counters. The hexes are big enough for the counters, sort of. They're the right scale. And then, things like this, some stock materials that you wouldn't get in a magazine version of a game. So you're getting sort of a deluxe version of an S&T game style, in terms of the component. The components are more deluxe, or higher quality, higher expense at least, than what you would get. The rule book is 24 pages, which is probably pushing it a little bit, but only 18 of that is actual meat of the rule book. And if you take away the index, the cover page, you're getting it to about the right size. That's 16 pages. That was kind of the magical. There's a lot of historical information. Again, that would probably show up in the magazine. Why am I going on about this? I don't know, because that's what it reminds me of. It feels like I should be thinking about it as that and not as a box game. Within that, no. And you could put it on the same level as Fifth Core, which is a good example to choose because this takes Balkowski's ideas from, say, Korea, or Korean War, and Lee versus Grant, and then on through the Civil War series of a pulsed movement with units flipping over when they're finished, whatever, and variable action points. So the turn is very interactive, with one player moving some pieces, then other player moving some pieces until both are done, or don't want to move anymore, or both pass, or there's a random end as well in the game. It takes that kind of idea. It goes a little further with the Korean War idea by adding the concept of assets that came from the Korean War. That was a really, really clever move on Korean War, and it seems to work pretty well here. I don't think it would work as a generalized World War II grand tactical, is I guess what they call it. I consider this sort of operational model, because you would have to account for truly armored or mechanized units. But the units that came out of the, right out of the beachhead are obviously not. What about the German units that are present? Well, this may have been the choice of why the designer chose Omaha Beachhead. You don't have Panzer units coming in here for the most part. You've got Fallschirmer, and I don't know what else. What else do the Germans have here? I'm pretty sure they don't have an armored command here. We got some SS Recon, which probably is supposed to be a little faster than it shows in the game. So assume that like they're already stretching it for this in terms of the rule system, because it uses the base idea of an infantry component, infantry units with armored components. Now the armored components don't give you additional speed, and in fact all the infantry moves sort of at the same rate. So it's sort of a special case, but I could see the system being extended to better cover for the kind of movement that you'd allow with armored units. Now you can kind of do something with leapfrogging and stuff, but it still doesn't feel like armored warfare. They took those ideas, which, you know, the Korean War is one of my favorite games. Not just because of the innovative mechanisms, but also because of the topic and how well it handles it. And combined it with the ideas from that Central Front series, which is you can push units as far as you like with friction. Now, what works well with that, what particularly works for that, as opposed to, say, let's take Great Campaigns of the American Civil War or the Lee versus Grant, where you're allowed to move each stack once, if I recall correctly, during your initiatives. Once it's done, it's done. Whatever it does, you've committed to it. Well, that doesn't give you really this temporal sequence out of, or it doesn't give you as much of one out of a given game turn. So in this, you commit units to do something, they're marching off and doing that, but you can expend, you can push your units more and pull them back when it becomes obvious that they're not supposed to do that. Now, that causes some fuzziness in terms of how time works and everything. But on the other hand, the Great Campaigns of the American Civil War also has issues, which is, for example, the order that I'm moving my pieces. I can still push my units, but then I'm just doing sort of the force march, just like out of the old I-Go-You-Go systems. So one of the big differentiations here is it's giving you a different type of view of the ability to make sort of, to order your decisions based on what you're going to see. And I find that very appealing from a gameplay perspective, and I also think that although it does have some issues that it draws in terms of timing, those issues are made up for by the fact that it is taking something into account of the idea that both sides are still doing stuff all at once, and a move that I make somewhere might require you to react in a different way. I've always liked systems that have that kind of reactive capability from a philosophical stance. From a play stance, they make the solo and honestly post gaming a little harder, but whatever. Let's talk about the components, and then I'll get to a little bit more detail on the rules. The map has got ugly. And worse than that, it's difficult to understand. In particular, the choices of the different colors on it are elevation levels, and the choice of the ordering of the elevation levels does not give you any kind of intuitive reaction there. I found things like Sicily easier to deal with, although even that was somewhat problematic. It feels like this decision to make colors which are close to each other not run into each other, and maybe there are problems with that, for people who have a difficulty discerning two colors from one another. If you put them that are close to each other, if you put them next to each other, that becomes very difficult to see. Something that could have helped is within each color section to have some kind of symbol. I've seen games that do this that tell you what the level is for that. The counters, like the hexism, and it's that heavy stock that Victor Games uses, which is Poochie. It means kind of, I mean, with this game you can get away with it, but with some of their games, it does mean you really want to use Plexi on them. I'm not a big fan of using Plexi. Most of you probably might like it for your paper maps. There's no great downside to using Plexi with these games. It's not like the Clash of Arms games, which are just as poochy, if not more, but have this beautiful texture that you just do not want to cover with anything. You want to rub your fingers against it. Okay, I'm a weirdo. The unit counters and the informational counters, etc., they're serviceable. The one problem that I had with them, well, there's a few problems. Let's be fair. One of the biggest ones is the backside of them have their fatigue side. I found that not distinguishable enough, especially for my aging eyes. Things with like a white bar on the back or whatever would be easier to deal with. Also, the specific, the differentiation as to what units matter for what, well, divisional composition means something, but not a whole hell of a lot. And they're colored so that it's very easy to tell what division something is. Unfortunately, it's only by the regimental ID that you can tell which units are of which regiment, and you kind of have to keep those together or move them. There are important benefits to working together with your own regiment. For that, icons might have worked better. I know, sort of like the Dean Essig games, the American Civil War ones, have little symbols on them that make it much easier to tell which unit something's a part of without having to resort to like another color or something confusing. You know, there's enough information there for most things. In this era, though, I'm not sure that. I mean, certainly it was there were games coming out with symbols like that on them. So I think it would have been plausible, but I don't know their particular art and graphics restrictions. So you got this big complicated thing that gives you all the reinforcements. It's a light stock. Gives you a really complicated and hard to use terrain effects chart, but you don't really need it for the most part. The movement effects you can absorb pretty quickly, and these are all explained in the rules. You have this little mod calculator, which is almost essential for remembering the level of mods that the number of die roll modifications that occur during a combat are humongous. In fact, this is the list. And you got to go through this in each combat. Yes, you will remember most of them, but there are a lot here. You're going to forget things, so it's almost this tedious chore each time through. Decent stock on these as well. Somewhat innovative combat tables. You get your ground combat. It's designed in a different way than you're going to be used to. You've got the defender's strength along here, the attacker's strength cross references to it. That gives you the base column. You're not looking at an odds differential, but every possible strength combination is accounted for individually with the specific intent. And that makes it easier to explain in the rules. It may have been impossible to record it may have been very difficult to record what you've got, but I don't think so. It looks like they're just odds charts that are represented in a different way. And that's a little confusing to people who are used to war games. This is not a game I would suggest as a starting war game, which means you're going to have cut your teeth on the odds charts already, so I don't know how much of an advantage there is for that. You have a barrage table whose main purpose is to soften up units before you attack them. And a whole bunch of different operations that units can do, each of which cost you operations points, I guess. The rule book itself is pretty good. I view victory games as kind of, when they get them right, as kind of the gold standard. Now, Balkowski is also well known for writing really good rule books. But I find this one to be at a good level between readability, in terms of you look it over the first time even, and you kind of have a pretty good idea of what's going on. You may need to push some pieces because there's some really different concepts here. And use as a reference. Somebody had mentioned there was something that was contradictory. I looked for it during play because I kind of knew what it was, and I couldn't find it. I think it may be a contradiction between two different concepts that are actually separate, and it's not a contradiction at all. It's just, but I could easily be wrong. There could be a place where it's covered twice. So let me talk about how the game systems, the efficacy of each one of them. So you don't have any kind of trying to think of how to put this. So supply, for example, doesn't really affect your combat capability, but it affects your recovery capability. You're in more trouble, though, in terms of combat even, if your line of communications is cut off. So you basically have an infinite supply line for communications. That's your combat supply line. But if you want to recover units, you had better get them hooked up to the road network. And that's the main difference between those. The fatigue system, okay. So when you move units, they flip over, they're fatigued. If they continue moving, they take additional friction points against them, which is one of their strength points. They don't have a lot of strength points, so that's a big deal. Well, this ends up, there's a fairly large number of pieces on the map, most of which are going to be flipped over every turn, almost every one of which you have to do a little mechanical action at the end of the turn. This is a tedious mechanical process. And there's not much more that can be said about it. It's a pain in the butt. The operations points, this adds a cute little... So we've seen games where one side and then the other get to do so many operations. Sometimes it's a balanced amount, sometimes it's random. This is one where you get a completely random amount, so you're not necessarily getting the same amount of effort as your enemy. You'll be able to play out all your points for the turn unless something weird happens. There is a turn end die roll which can be done. But you have the capability to drop into a deficit, and that makes things really, really interesting. Because you get so many operations points, and if you want to be a little bit more active, you can give a bonus to your opponent for how many operation points they get. I think that's a really elegant way to handle the, oh shit, I can't do anything and I really need to do this. If you really need to do this, you're willing to pay that price. The truth of the matter is, though, in this game, usually, there are a few exceptions, but usually neither player really cares about that giving the enemy a little bit of a bonus. Well, to tell you the truth, if the Germans get a very bad roll and need to go down into these, they are definitely giving the U.S. player an advantage. So the U.S. player generally doesn't care too much about how much the German makes. On the other hand, the German usually doesn't want to do very much, and his die roll is going to be sufficient. So it's kind of a waste in this game, but it's a really cool feature that in other Impulse games would be cool. Okay, so like I said, the basic unit that you're moving around on the board is just an infantry unit, and they're all pretty much the same except for strength points, their combat effectiveness. Well, their combat effectiveness, they're pretty much the same for movement. um, that could have been changed if you wanted to put specifically motorized units and stuff. Additional rules could have been added to make the game able to handle that, I think, without really doing too much damage. But the choice to use infantry units only definitely would restrict this from being able to be used in circumstances where you'd have a lot of armor running around. It might be okay that there are some armored units if the terrain doesn't really favor it around, but you're not going to be able to do Kursk with this, okay, without modifying it greatly. Again, I think it could be flexible enough to handle that, but that's what you have. Like in many of Balkowski's games, you have this kind of choice between how much of your operations for a given unit, when you select a unit, you want to use for movement, for attack, and some operations you do, or some actions you do, just take up all your movement points, essentially. Action points is actually what they call them. There was something I wanted to talk about. Oh yeah. You can activate a unit multiple times in a given turn, but not multiple times in a given operation die roll. Each time you activate it, though, beyond the first one flips it over to the fatigue side. Each further activation is going to weaken it, and it's going to have to sit and rest somewhere. This is a game that's all about time and rushing to get somewhere, so you will want to push your units. That's hard for me, but it's getting easier as I get older. I stopped caring so much about my cardboard dying. Artillery is handled in a kind of interesting way. You don't individually fire artillery units. You allocate an observation point which determines how effective your artillery is. Any artillery in range can fire. You pay a single operations point cost for however much artillery you're going to bring in. And you want to get that number kind of high, the amount of artillery you bring in, to be able to guarantee yourself that you're going to demoralize or disorder your opponent. And that's all it does. It's just a disruption. That disruption is important for combat. If it's a demoralization, it flips into their fatigue side, which essentially adds a point of friction if they're not already fatigued. I think the artillery works very well. I really like that idea of softening up the enemy. Oh, artillery also has another factor, which is if you're attacked and you're in range of an unfatigued artillery that can support you, you get defensive fire support from it. So, even if you're not attacking, the Germans probably aren't. That's one of my kind of possible grumps about this game is it really is the Americans are making an attack to try to get somewhere. The Germans are on the defensive the entire time. I don't mind such games. I like being on the defensive, and I would really love to play the Germans on the defensive in this because I think it's kind of challenging. Of course, I read other people who said that they thought that the U.S. didn't have a chance, so maybe I'm not the right person to be playing the defense. I usually am pretty decent at it, but I definitely screwed up a couple of little things in my planning. The combat itself, like chart, using a 10-sided die, you're able to smooth out the chart and make it so that various differences in the odds themselves, differences in the modifier totals, end up doing less. It's not as big a jump for the most part. It tends to be a fairly smooth transition. So you get a little bit of an advantage off of each plus that you add to that die roll. In in the combat, there's, first of all, there's this huge list of modifiers, and then straight from Korean War, there's this armored subsequence where you determine a differential between. It's not straight out of Korea. The Korean War had one where I believe there was a die roll, an additional die roll for the armored subsequence. For this, you actually are just comparing the modifiers of the armor and the counter and the anti-tank values, and it's possible for the attacker to get additional bonuses by committing armor to the battle. If they commit no armor, it's possible that they will get penalized. But as long as they have some tanks in it, they will not take that penalty. The damage is in strength points, assets. I haven't explained this. So remember the key unit is the infantry. That's the thing that's moving around on the board for the most part, but it has assets attached to it. Those assets are generally armor or anti-tank assets. And they just add to your capability to handle that armored subsequence. And that's the only thing that they do in the game. But as an operations point, you can transfer assets from one unit to another. And I don't remember. I probably screwed up how it works. And I'm not going to go into the specifics of it because I think I screwed up when I played. But basically, you spend an operations point and you're able to draw assets from other units. Okay, I gotta see. Transfer assets. Yeah. So you pick a unit. Actually, I don't think I cheated ever. I think I just didn't really consider all my options. You pick a unit that's going to get the assets, and it can draw up to its limit from units that are close enough. What that means is your assets can be used for 2 units activations each turn very easily. So you use one unit, you attack with it, and this is why I say the armor does kind of have some bonuses in terms of movement and such. The infantry moves, it attacks, it's got assets with it. It took advantage of those assets. Now it transfers those assets to an unmoved unit, and that unmoved unit can still go and use those assets. Plus, you can use it multiple times. You know, the assets don't get hurt as the infantry gets tired, which means the infantry can be used multiple times and the armor just comes along with it. It all works out pretty well. Like I said, the German reinforcements come by a variable ability. Something I said at the end of my last thing, there is a fair amount of luck in this game. Let me tell you about it. First of all, the biggest things that I see in luck are the airstrikes the US gets. That's a random die roll. The reinforcements that the Germans get, that comes in by a number of random die rolls. If they do not get sufficient reinforcements, it's going to be a harder game. I think I got very few. And that may determine who wins the game. You know, those couple factors. Excuse me. Another, well, it is possible to get a wide variation of results. I said the chart is kind of smooth. It is, but you're using a 10-sided die, so that all that it's doing is stretching out the extremes in, you know, a regular D6 combat results table. Your successes on a given artillery fire could be a significant impact on whether or not you can afford to make an attack in a given turn, whatever. So there's a lot of places for significant luck. There's some of them that are more important, like the German reinforcements, the airstrikes. Well, if you crap out on the turns you need them, that can be very key, and it's very possible that you could, you know, lose out on some important die rolls and then get airstrikes up the ass when they're not really important, when you're not in a position to launch an attack. So, you know, you're a Murphy's Rule kind of guy and you don't, and things always seem to go bad for you, you're going to find places where they're going to go really, really badly for you. What's next? The D-Day rules themselves, it handles the landing with special rules basically, which slow down the initial movement on board, etc. It has these resistance nests. One thing that is kind of a shame, given that it's a boxed game and, you know, not just a very, very limited counter sheet for a magazine game, is they didn't give you a lot of variability in the game. In particular, the historical choices for defense of the beaches are used when both Rommel and von Rundstedt had different conceptions. What you're looking at is basically a compromise defense. It would be interesting to see what other defensive situations would have. Just a few, you know, different options. They put one little option in, and it is tiny. You reduce the strength of all the units on the beachhead, and you get one extra infantry unit. I actually kind of like that one. I think, so here's the thing. The problem with the Rommel solution is if you're making the beach strong enough that the Allies might not be able to take it, they lose the game because, you know, I mean, they would have to come up with multiple waves of attack on the beachhead. So you'd need more rules for that. You couldn't do that very simply. You'd need another set of special rules for regenerating waves of attack. If the beachheads were difficult enough, if the beach defenses were difficult enough that you might get thrown back. And it would actually become not a very interesting game because it comes down to once you crack those beaches, if you crack those beaches, there's not going to be enough to stop you. You know? I guess it depends on the cost coming from the beach, but I do understand the decision not to put that in play. When I first was, you know, looking at the game and discussing it on the video, I thought that was kind of something missing. But, you know, it would be a lot of counters. Well, I don't know if it would be a lot of counters. You could just like double the resistance power or something. But it would be a fair amount of additional rules, maybe a page or so, that would really just be kind of a, well, that's interesting. And on the other hand, the von Rundstedt one, they kind of did a hand wave to that by reducing the resistance on the beaches and giving you one extra unit. That doesn't really give you a whole hell of a lot of force, but it does give you a little bit more mobile defense, and it is probably as close as you can get to what would be applied there. Anything more significant than that, if you gave them more units or something, would pretty much mean the U.S. isn't going to get to push down. I think that's more or less everything I want to talk about. I think this is a really, really cool game for the subject matter. By which I mean, I really like the clever implementations. They get you thinking a little bit about the game design, and in some cases you can say, that causes some weird things. Okay. But overall it's a positive, and the actual gameplay is pretty good. Is very good that it derives from it. This having to agonize over which unit you're going to move, what is important to move, etc. On the other hand, the subject matter is not in my wheelhouse at all. I'm into I'm just not really that into things that are World War II, unless they're grand strategic, and at this small scale especially. I love my gunpowder era um, individual battles. These tactical games that aren't skirmish; they're tactical. Uh, Something along this, even something along this size, for those eras would be a harder swallow for me. And you put it to World War II, and yeah, I don't know. But yeah, given the limited scope of the attack, that of the situation the game covers, just a few days of trying to form the beachhead, I don't think that you could make a better game. You might be able to make some kind of different design that is about as good, but yeah, if you're interested in the subject matter, I definitely recommend this. It's got a piss poor rating, and the only thing that leads me to think of that, because it's World War II, everybody loves World War II, right? The only thing that leads me to think about that is that the map is so hideous that people and difficult to work with, and maybe the mechanical part of unflipping your units. Some of the concepts are already new enough that you're investing a lot in that, and now you're investing in these other things that are kind of annoying, this mechanical aspect and this graphical hindrance, that it just doesn't seem worth it to people who are giving it a shot. But honestly, I think it's a pretty damn good game for what it is. All right, up it goes.